I'm really pleased to welcome this amazing panel of people for this event. So Black Voices on Greater China is a project supported by the Davis Polk Leadership Fellowship, for those who don't know. We are co-sponsoring this event with the Society for Chinese Law at Columbia Law School. Many thanks to them for helping support this event. We're going to have a discussion on how African residents in China are affected by the Chinese legal system, especially in light of rising xenophobia in China following the COVID-19 outbreak, as well as global Black Lives Matter protests and the growing attention this has brought to issues of discrimination worldwide. As we explore this topic, we'll be in conversation with Dr. Roberto Castillo, who is Cultural Studies Professor at Lingnan University in Hong Kong, Dr. Aaron Tesfaye, Professor and Chair of the Department of Political Science, Legal Studies, and Urban Studies at William Paterson University of New Jersey, and Dr. Guangzhi Huang, Assistant Professor of Interdisciplinary Studies at Massachusetts College of Liberal Arts. My name is Kori Cooper. I started the Black Voices on Greater China project, and I will be monitoring the discussion today. So just as a brief introduction to the topic, there has been extensive engagement between China and African countries that has produced vast exchanges of goods and personnel over the past recent decades. In 2012, it was estimated that more than 100,000 Africans lived in the southern city of Guangzhou, China. Nevertheless, Black communities in China have long reported inconsistent immigration law enforcement and racial profiling, an issue that has come under the spotlight since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic and the onset of renewed Black Lives Matter protests. Recent months saw increased reports of random passport inspections, incidents of housing discrimination, and arbitrary detainment. In response, the Chinese government claims to be addressing illegal entry of foreigners in imported cases of COVID-19. Such incidents have drawn the attention of commentators across the globe to the treatment of African migrant workers in China by law enforcement. So to begin, I want to go ahead and ask just some questions that, for those who may not already be familiar with the topic, will be of interest. And we can start with perhaps Professor Tesfaye, and then go to Professor Huang, and then Professor Castillo. So the first question would be, what does the market look like for African workers currently in China or hoping to enter China? What kind of jobs are they doing there?
Well, the short answer is most of the Africans in China, primarily in Guangzhou, in South China, are traders or work in the informal sector. And so I think the prospect for traders and informal workers of Africans in China looks very good because the Chinese economy is growing. And as you know, China, since it accessed the World Trade Organization in 2001, and showing rapid economic growth, it has become a magnet, not only for Africans to travel to China for opportunities, but also for other immigrants that really scholars have not really talked about. There are Lebanese in China, other Arabs in China. There are all sorts of immigrant communities in China also. But of course, specifically, it's the Africans that face discrimination in China, particularly in the Guangzhou province.
Right. I think I like to just second what Professor Tesfaye said. So most Africans in Guangzhou in China, they are traders. So some of them are more established than the others. So the more established ones, they have founded offices, representative offices or trading companies in Guangzhou. And then there are the less established ones who are more of the itinerary traders who, come and go, crisscross the border a lot. So there are some people who manage to find jobs in China too, teaching English, or sometimes working, undocumented. I've met people working as, cooks, but these are very, very minority. The most Africans are traders. I agree with Professor Tesfaye. But I also, since Professor Tesfaye just said that the prospect looks very good, I would sort of slightly disagree and said that the prospect looked very good in the past. There are scholarship saying that since 2008 or since 2014, things have been sort of going downhill because of law enforcement and how much social control Africans experienced in Guangzhou. And based on my experience doing research from early 2000s to today, it seems that there's a noticeable shrinking of number of Africans in Guangzhou. So maybe Professor Castillo can jump in on this and share his experience.
No, I mean, I think you guys answered very much the question posed by Kori. The only thing that I would like to add, perhaps, is that when we talk about foreign presence in China, as Professor Tesfaye was highlighting, obviously not only about Africans, but any type of foreigners in China, one of the things that I normally recommend people outside of China and outside of Asia to consider is that we need to sort of change the chip that we have in our brains when we think about migration and mobility from the global south to the global north, right? So China has a completely different regime of citizenship, of mobility, of foreigner control, foreigner management. So we cannot even talk about African migrants as the way in which we would talk about, I don't know, Mexican migrants in the US, right? We're talking about very different types of individuals, but also very different socio-economic and socio-political conditions that are in place in China that create a very different regime for people to have that experience of migration, if you want. So just the point I'm making here is that the system of citizenship management that China has and the system of immigration that I always like to take with a grain of salt, that word in China, immigration. China does not have an immigration department. China has an entry and exit administration bureau, and an entry and exit administration implies or assumes that if you enter, you exit. So there's no path to permanent settlement. There's not that sort of hope for a foreigner that is coming to work in China to stay there forever. So we need to differentiate China to Western liberal democracies in the ways in which they manage foreigners coming to the country, as would be the case in the US, I would assume.
Thank you, Professor Castillo. That leads me to my next question. And you might have something you want to add here, so we can start with you and then go back the other way. How does China's work visa policies, how do they function? And how may these work visas fail to accommodate the needs of international migrants, specifically African migrants, but also, as Professor Tesfaye mentioned, Lebanese and so on?
See, the system of working visas, if you want, would be very different to the green cards that you have in the US, right? In China, most foreigners that come to China cannot work in China. So most Africans that come to China actually come as either business people with business visas, with visitor visas, with tourist visas, with student visas, but not so much with working visas. China has in place a system in which if you want to work in China as a foreigner, there's a couple of different types of visas, but the most important one that they have is called the X, or sorry, I got mixed it now, SET or X, I don't remember right now. I think it's SET, Z visa, and that one you have to be a foreign expert, right? So, and to become a foreign expert in China, you have to do a lot of examinations, and there are a lot of qualifications and credentials that you need to present. So most people that come and work in China, and when we're talking about Africans, they do so by having business visas or other types of commercial and trading visas. Most of them on tourist visas throughout the last maybe 15 years. Now, just to answer your question and to let the others speak, over the last maybe 4 or 5 years, the Chinese visa system has become very strict, right? Back in the day, in the late 2000s, 2008, 2009, and around that time, it was very easy to renew a tourist visa inside the country for people from anywhere in the world, and any type of African country could just renew the visa pretty much endlessly in China, right? But things have been changing a lot in China. And nowadays, if you get like a tourist visa or even a business visa, you only can enter China for around about 30 days. And then after that, you need to exit the country to renew your visa, right? And that creates a bit of a strange loophole, because a lot of people, a lot of young African, especially young West African entrepreneurs, come to China with hopes of making it very quickly, and they're forced to overstay their visas, and then they enter difficult situations, much like what happens in the West when people just stay or overstay in another country illegally, right?
If I may add to what Roberto had said, there is also, in terms of getting a visa, there is ethnic profiling in China. I can talk of my experience. I had an opportunity to teach in Macau, the University of St. Joseph. It's a Jesuit university, and for a year in 2011, and I wanted to go to Guangzhou, just across Macau and Hong Kong are the special administrative regions of China. So I wanted to go to Guangzhou. I thought, since I have a visa for a year in Macau, I just could cross over and take a bus and go to Guangzhou. But no, it was like, I had to apply for a visa. It was like going to another country. And so I was scrutinized very carefully. I was asked if I knew anybody in China. And I said, in mainland China. And I told them, no, I don't. I'm a professor in New Jersey, and I'm trying to visit and see Guangzhou and then on to Beijing and so forth. The Chinese immigration officials were a little bit confused by me because I also told them I'm African. And so the usual stereotype of an African is a dark person, a black man. And obviously I have this resurrected Abyssinian face, Ethiopian face, which confuses a lot of people when I say I'm African. And so there was a slew of questions actually that were asked of me that were probably wouldn't be asked of another foreigner, a European, for example, or an American, for example, and so forth and so on. So Africans are scrutinized much more. And of course, and most people that go to Africa, to China are male Africans, very few female Africans. And a colleague did a research on the country of origin of Africans that go to China and are primarily engaged in trade in Guangzhou. So in order of representation in China, Nigerians are number one, Senegal, and then Mali, and then Guinea, and then Ghana, Congo-Kinshasa, and South Africa, Tanzania, Uganda, and so forth, But definitely there is ethnic profiling of Africans when they seek a visa to go to China. Both, I think, in Chinese embassies in Africa, and also for travelers who happen to be in Hong Kong or Macau and are trying to enter to China. But as Roberto also explained, I think China is not an immigrant country like the U.S. or Canada, and so they don't have the Department of Immigration, and so they do scrutinize people that come, particularly Africans that come. And I think the ethnic profiling also has to do with degrees of racism that the Chinese public gets from Western media, and the consideration that Africans are, involved in the informal market, are drug peddlers and so forth and so on. Even though there is a vibrant legal trading and commercial community in Guangzhou, I wanted to underline that. So the Chinese are not free from the stereotyping of Africans that is found also in the major European cities and some Asian countries also.
Sorry, could I just make a very quick comment on top of what Professor Tesfaye highlighted? I mean, he's pointing, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, yeah. I think Professor Tesfaye is pointing to a very complex issue, right? In terms of representation, perceptions, racism, race, and so on and so forth, that we could definitely talk about in a minute. I just want to highlight that when he's right to say that Africans are and have been historically, and by historically, I mean the last 20 or 30 years, maybe 20 years, scrutinized in a different way when they apply for visas, for instance. But I think that we just need to sort of bring a little bit of nuance to that statement, because it's definitely different groups of Africans that have suffered more scrutiny, if you want, right? West Africans in particular, Nigerians in particular, have been really exposed to scrutiny and have been struggling to renew visas and get visas, both back in Nigeria and in Asia or in China. But I always like to highlight, because we normally focus on Africans and therefore on Blackness, right? But many of these problems in China are problems, as Professor Tesfaye was highlighting, problems of perception, right? For instance, Colombians, right? And I'm not a Colombian, I'm a Mexican originally, but Colombians get a lot of scrutiny in China too, right? Why is that? Because of perceptions, yes, but also because certain individuals in China engage in certain activities that are not legal or not seen in a good light in China, right? And the same happens with Nigerians, which in many ways, I'm not generalizing all of Nigerians, definitely, but some Nigerians do certain things in China that also affect the reputation. And this is the perception that other Africans in China and in Guangzhou have also, that the Nigerian community sometimes affects the reputation of other communities in the city. So by all means, what Professor Tesfaye is saying is correct. I'm just trying to bring a little bit of nuance to this idea of scrutiny, right?
Professor, detail to what the two professors just said. So Professor Castillo just mentioned that the visa categories, right? So he's right. Z visa is a major category visa category that many African traders use, and that's actually the for the more established traders. So those who have established companies or representative office in China, they will use the Z visa to enter China, and then but after that, the Z visa is only good for 30 days. After that, they have to apply for a yearly, temporary residency. These are actually this temporary residency is compared to the rest of Africans, they are only small numbers. The majority of the Africans in Guangzhou or China, they fall into the M visa category. This is for the short-term traders in Guangzhou. The problem with first, to get a Z visa, the threshold is very high. The bar is very high, so you have to have money to establish a company, or you have to have a representative office in Guangzhou. But if you go for the M visa route, the problem is that it's only good for, especially if you're going to China for the first time, it's only good for 30 days, as Professor Castillo mentioned, which means if you have a single entry M visa, you have to leave China and apply again. Or even if you have a multiple entry visa, you'll have to leave every 30 days. And then in the past, Africans have been going to Macau or Hong Kong and then return the same day. But since I think late 2000 and early, I think 2010, Macau and Hong Kong have been limiting or restricting entry from certain African countries. I think Ghana, especially Nigerians, and they have been restricted from entering Hong Kong and Macau. So now they actually have to go back to their home country, and then or some other countries, and return to China, which obviously adds to the cost of traveling and also the hassle of traveling as well. So if to bring things into perspective, I'm saying that in the United States, if you are traveling on a business visa, you get to stay in the United States for 6 months. So 30 days is really, really short if we're talking about people doing business in China, because they have to take time to find, the goods that they're looking for, negotiate, make sure they are manufactured properly, and then shipped back to Africa properly. So that's one reason why this Chinese immigration regulations, especially visa categories, have yet to very properly accommodate short-term business traders in Guangzhou, and this affects Africans the most, I think.
Thank you for this. This is very interesting. I want to pick up on what we touched upon when it comes to how different communities are treated. So my next question is about how does the cultural understanding of race and nation in China affect law enforcement and policy making that affects foreign workers? And I would like to hear more about specifically the Nigerian community, but also how other communities might be treated differently as well. And we can start with Professor Huang and then go to Tesfaye and then Castillo.
Did you mention the cultural, how the cultural understanding of race and affects the policies?
Yes, how the cultural understanding of race and nationality affects the law enforcement practices in the policies.
I think we first have to understand there is a dialectic relationship between law enforcement and policy and cultural understanding as well. It's just not a one-way street, right? It's not just cultural understanding affecting law enforcement and policy, but law enforcement and policy also affect how people understand Africans as well, right? So obviously there's long held prejudice among Chinese toward Africans. Africans probably since the 19th century have been perceived to be backward, carrying disease, lawless, or had little respect for laws. These are not new. They are historical racial prejudices, coming from Western racial order, but also having fused with local racial stereotypes from ancient times. And these prejudices or prejudicial thinking has obviously been used to justify law enforcement, tough law enforcement on African communities in China. But also we have to look at it from the other way as well, how policy and law enforcement have been actually constructing racial perception among Chinese as well, right? Since I would argue late 2000s, policies, the Chinese government, especially the local government in Guangzhou, have been treating Africans almost as rural migrants, in China. They are invaders. They are difficult to manage. They are undocumented. So constructing this racial stereotype that Africans are illegal immigrants, Sanfei or the triple illegals, right? So urban Chinese can easily fit this narrative into an existing model. They have been perceiving rural migrants in a similar fashion for a long time. So, rural migrants are perceived to be, to lack, civility, lack understanding of law, and they also carry disease, and there are a lot of crimes in their community as well. And many African traders happen to actually live in communities shared by many rural migrants. So that sort of adds to the stigma as well. So I think we have to understand the mutually constituted, relationship between culture and law enforcement and policy.
Yes, yeah, I understand, and I do share your views. I just want to add that, though, in China, I think Africans are identified primarily by their black skin color, not by their country of origin, language, or religious beliefs. And so there is this conflation of Black and African identities, and Chinese perceptions tends to be rather homogeneous and often tainted with negative stereotypes. Of course, at the national level, there is this tension between the official China-Africa political relationships. It goes back to the era of Mao and third-world solidarity and all that, and current Africa-Chinese relations, where China sees Africa as a strategic partner, and I cannot generalize about African nations, but clearly it's a very asymmetrical relationship. So the official Chinese understanding is they don't want any of this stuff that is particularly happening at the provincial level to go against the official, well, I don't want to call it propaganda, but solidarity, South-South solidarity, Africa-China relations, and so forth and so on. But at the provincial level, particularly in Guangzhou and maybe even in other places, the perception of Africans is very different. It's based on racially, and of course, to understand this, and I think we all know that historically China has always considered itself a world civilization, the Middle Kingdom, and that all foreigners are barbarians and stuff, the Wall of China and all that. So the African presence in China for some is very unsettling. And even though there is discrimination of rural Chinese and urban China and stuff, that is not based on racial identity. And so racial identity being Blackness, and this whole thing reinforced by Western media that portrays Blacks differently, Africans differently, had bad consequences in ordinary China-Africa relationships. But that does not mean that Africans are isolated. They have made connections, even with the rural Chinese that immigrate to Guangzhou and so forth and so on. And they do have economic relationships and so forth and so on. I just wanted to point out that the relationship of Africa with China on the surface, nationally, continental-wide, may look like solidarity, South-South solidarity. And to an extent, China is still a third world country, even though it's a rising power. But in practical fact, I think there is a racial component in the way African traders struggle daily to make a living in China. Thank you.
Just quickly add that to clarify that I don't mean to say that Chinese necessarily see Africans in the exact same light as they would a rural migrant. What I'm trying to point out is that racism is a very, very adaptive animal. So in different historical and social and cultural contexts, it takes on different forms, right? It has different manifestations. It localizes in different, social contexts. I think in China, we need to take into account its, historical perception of certain, incoming groups. And in the at least in this particular context, I think we also need to see how, racism, the manifestation of racism in this particular context shares some of its genealogy with anti-rural sentiments in China. That's the expression of racism in China. That's what I'm meant to say.
Okay.
Could I just quickly jump in and say something? Yeah. Okay. I just want to say, I mean, I really certainly subscribe what Guangzhi was saying. I obviously maybe it needs to be nuanced, but I don't think that you need to backtrack it. I think that besides or beyond the discussion of blackness that Professor Tesfaye was highlighting, there's also this other comparison that I think is very very productive in the sense of comparing foreigners in China with ethnic minorities. You like to call it rural migrants. I'm not so sure about that concept. I use more internal migrants or ethnic minorities, but I get the point, right? So I don't think you need to backtrack that point. But I just want to highlight something. I think that in the West, and I think that Huang would agree with me. Agree with me. There's this long-standing history of representations of China in which we represent and speak and imagine China in very monumental ways, right? There's this idea of the homogeneous society, right? 93% Han, as if like 1.4 billion people were the same, right? And when we talk about, and the reason why I'm highlighting this is because I actually think that we need to debunk this myth of a homogeneous society, right? And in relation to the topic that we're discussing today, when we try to debunk this myth, then we need to understand that different cities, different provinces, different locales, places with different types of Chinese cultures deal and treat with foreigners in different ways, right? If you talk with Africans and Black people, because that's the topic for today, that have been living in China for many years, they would tell you that their experiences in Guangzhou or in Guangdong province would be very different than those experiences they've been having in Beijing, in Shanghai, in Western China, and so on and so forth. And even within Guangdong province, one thing is to live in Guangzhou, and one other thing is to live in Foshan, in Dongguan, in Zhejiang. Very different experiences, very different ways in which local governments and municipalities deal with foreigners. And most important, very different ways in which people in those locales or localities understand foreignness, right? I mean, this is a complex topic. How do we understand, in this case, Blackness? How do we understand foreigners? Who is an African, right? Who is a Black person? A very dark-skinned Indian sometimes can be seen as a Black person in China. You never know, right? So I just want to highlight that because I think it's very important that we consider the fact that China is bigger than Europe, maybe the size of continental United States, with like four or five times more population than the United States. Yet when we talk about Europe or the United States, we always talk about all this diversity of cultures, and when we do that about China, we don't do that. And just to answer quickly the question that Kori posed in relation to how, I think that the original question was how race and nationality impact on law enforcement. I just want to highlight quickly that, you know, in the last census, which took place almost 9 or 10 years ago, the Chinese government reported around about 650,000 foreigners residing in the country. It's difficult to know what residing means because there are different forms of abode. Some of them can stay for longer. Different provinces have different regulations, whatever. But the 650,000, right? Now, some scholars were highlighting that maybe half of that 650,000 were people from the African continent, right? And then, which was not really based on any strict data, right? And then when we talk about Guangzhou, a lot of people talk about 100,000, 500,000, 200,000, talk about numbers, right? Like really, I've been doing ethnographic work in Guangzhou over the last decade. And I tell you that when they were saying that there were 200,000 Africans living in Guangzhou, the real number was around about 15,000 permanent residents, right? Now, people coming in and out of the country, well, that's another story. I mean, the Japanese and the Australians that come to the US for 2 weeks to visit, they're not the part of the Australian or the Japanese population of America, right? They're just like transients or people moving, right? So it's a little bit difficult when we start talking about numbers in China. But I just to finalize my point, I definitely think that when we talk about certain foreign minorities, in this case, Africans or Black people in China, and the ways in which they are seen and perceived by people as one homogeneous ethnic group, because a lot of people in China don't see any differences between East Africans, West Africans, African Americans, or Black British. They don't see those differences, right? So when we talk about a group of Black people that is sort of thriving in a city as Guangzhou, there are definitely very interesting comparisons as to how the Chinese government deals with ethnic minorities. So I'm coming back all the way back to the point that Huang was making in relation to how the government manages African populations in the country. In particular, in Guangdong province, I think it's very similar to the ways in which they deal with ethnic minorities, such as Uyghur, right? So they put the Africans as the non-Han, non-Chinese ethnic minorities that they have in China, and they treat them in a rather different way, right? Sorry for extending.
No, I really appreciate those remarks. And first I want to ask, are you guys okay with maybe going a few minutes over? Because we have a lot of good questions. Would that be okay?
I'm high on coffee, so you can keep going.
Great. So first I want to, before we go into questions, I want to recap the amazing points that have been made. So Professor Tesfaye, he remarked on, you know, often conflation between perceptions of Blackness and nationality in China, how this has come about over the course of time due to accumulation of prejudices, both internally generated, but also coming from outside the country. And he also earlier in the conversation drew on his own personal experiences with that. And then Professor Huang talked about how racism often becomes localized, how it looks in particular ways in different parts of the world. In this case, in China, we might think of it in terms of the xenophobia paradigm that he mentioned, the triple illegal paradigm, in which African migrants are sometimes caught up in when it comes to how they're treated by law enforcement. And then Professor Castillo brought up, you know, some really pertinent points they think also are applicable to the US when it comes to how we oftentimes, you know, see non-Han Han minorities on the periphery in China, and how we really have to complicate that view and nuance it and recognize that there are in fact a lot of different ethnic struggles within China that, you know, make this issue even more complicated, and that we can only really understand it properly if we're willing to examine, those problems of Han chauvinism, of history of colonization outside the West, all those related issues. So one of the first questions that I want to ask, and we can start with Professor Tesfaye and then go to Huang and Castillo, is, let's see. The question is, why can't African countries achieve some leverage from China's desire to have strategic partners in Africa? Could they pressure China to reciprocate and make it easier for African businessmen to set up representative offices in China by extending the visa period to something longer than 30 days?
Well, I mean, we cannot generalize about Africa. Clearly, I think the most important countries for China in terms of resources are Congo Democratic Republic, Angola, Mozambique, and Nigeria. and so forth. You know, Africa also, I mean, China has, of course, relationships also with other countries, but they're just more political and have to do with security issues, you know, such as Ethiopia. The question is pertinent and it's very good. And of course, in our network, colleagues here and myself, a lot of studies have been done, a lot of papers have been written about African agency. You know, what do Africans want from China? And a lot of scholars, particularly from the West, have seen this China-Africa relationships as well, some see it as colonial, some see it as you know, China as being the voracious dragon after the resources of Africa. I subscribe to the view that African leaders are rational actors in their negotiation with China. They know what they want, even though the relationship is very asymmetrical. As I said earlier, China sees Africa as a partner, strategic partner, because Africa helps China modernize through its resources. But I don't think a lot of African countries see China as a strategic partner. They see it as an economic partner, but you know, kind of a big brother. Because the demands of Africa are two things, and two things alone, which the West has not provided. One is capital, and the other is technology. China has been providing that for Africa. So to answer your questions, different African countries have different policies with China, and I yet have to see an activist leadership or leaders in Africa that can work out some sort of strategic demand from China so that the interest of African traders, the interest of African businessmen in Guangzhou or in other parts of China are anchored in some formal ways in which African businessmen can not only make a living, but also can profit and repatriate their profit back to their respective countries.
Right. So from my perspective, I think we need to look at the imbalance of bargaining power between African countries and China. I think, you know, if we look at, say, the current One Belt, One Road initiative, right? How much China has been investing in Africa. China, you know, many African countries really depend on the investment from China, while you know, having really little bargaining power when it comes to you know, negotiating the terms on those loans with China. So this is sort of the larger background, but also, you know, when it comes to how much this could affect the daily lives of traders in Guangzhou, that's a different story, because from the African government's perspective, I don't know how you know, much those traders in Guangzhou matter to this trade relationship between China and Africa, right? And we see that, you know, in the April incident, you know, when a lot of Africans were kicked out of their hotels, when African leaders did show solidarity with their people and, you know, push for changes, there is, you know, a certain degree of success, actually. But in most cases, from what I see, I could be wrong. African leaders are more concerned about the formal multilateral relationship with, the bilateral relationship with China, Chinese government, and the Chinese government's investment in Africa. So I don't know how much the African traders in Guangzhou factor into this relationship, right? But also we have to understand that from the Chinese government's perspective, these traders in Guangzhou, they are small-time traders, and they're not the multinational corporations that contribute significantly to the local economy, right? So I'm not discounting their importance. Actually, they're contributing in a myriad of ways to the most vulnerable population in China. Actually, they're helping rural migrants, ethnic minorities start a business, etc. But from the local government's perspective, they're contributing very little to their tax revenue. They are purchasing small amounts, and they are actually sometimes buying from even unlicensed manufacturers, right? And so I don't know how much local government care about these traders. And also we have to understand that from the local government's perspective, the representative of these African countries, actually, they have in the past met up with the local officials, tried to push for changes, but with little success, because the local government continue to see this relationship in terms of trade, in terms of commerce, not really paying too much attention to the lives of these workers, these African traders.
Professor Castillo, did you want to add anything?
No, I think the question was answered in a beautiful way by both of them.
That's fine. Yeah. Okay. So we have another. So just to quickly recap, because someone said they're really interested in hearing more about how COVID-19 has affected Africans. I can say we've definitely talked about how, as a result of the pandemic, there has been a crackdown, as Professor Huang just mentioned, on Africans when it comes to passport inspections, being kicked out of housing, receiving service from vendors. And I think in the beginning of the conversation, we also talked about how while things may have looked hopeful for Africans looking to find work in China before, now prospects definitely seem more dire. And so I guess dovetailing off of that, we have another question from someone asking, could you please invite the speakers to share how we can fix this problem? This is a hard question, but interesting to know any practical suggestions to approach this issue.
And which is the problem, sorry?
So the question is like, I guess, how can we address the problem of law enforcement treatment of African migrant workers? I think especially the profiling that we've been talking a lot about. I'm only guessing.
Well, I think, if I could just say something about this, I think that, okay, so the situation in Guangzhou in particular, so when we talk about Africans in Guangzhou, we're talking about a very specific type of situation and relationships that they have established there amongst themselves, but also with local, you guys like to call it law enforcement, but local authorities, right? Mm-hmm. So the experience that Africans have in Guangzhou would be radically different, as I said earlier, to people in other parts of the country, right? The experience of Blackness and race could be similar because there's always certain general perceptions all across China. But in terms of the dealing with the authority at the local level, I think that Guangzhou has been historically a very tense place, right? Now, what happened in April that Guangzhi was making a reference to, and I think that a lot of people, especially in American media, I am an obsessive follower of what happens in the US. I don't know why, but I like to torture myself. Yeah. So anyway, so I think that what was happening in April in 2020, April in China, coincided, as I don't have to explain to most of the audience in there, with the Black Lives Matter and all this instability that you were having. So in many ways, in Western media, Western imagination, this was kind of read within that other, within the transcript of what was going on in the United States, right? And as such, it came as a really a very important shock as to see that Africans or Black people in China were treated in this way. However, I think that what happened in Guangzhou was a very specific situation, and it cannot be representative of the experiences of Black people in China throughout the years, right? I mean, what happened in Guangzhou was, there are many reasons why that happened. We could talk about cultural reasons, cultural misunderstandings, problems of communication at the government level in China. Just to give you an example, a few days before that started happening, which we all saw these images of people getting evicted from their legally rented places of abode, people persecuted in the streets, harassed, arrested without any kind of legal procedure. But most of these things happen at a time in which there was a lot of anxiety in China about a possible or potential second outbreak. And especially a couple of days after Xi Jinping, the president of China, highlighted or recommended that municipalities and provinces needed to be very careful with new cases coming from abroad, right? Now, you know, talking about Guangzhou, a city of 12 million people with like thousands of law enforcement agents, no one can know who came from abroad 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, or who has been in the country for a long time. So there was a lot of paranoia, fear, and anxiety that foreign communities, not only Blacks, foreign communities would be the ones that were going to reintroduce the virus into China, right? Now, this happened in many cities, Beijing, Shanghai, and many other cities in which foreigners were harassed, stopped from getting into places, and so on and so forth. But in particular, the case of Guangzhou, the case in point was Black people or the African communities in the city, right? And we all saw that. So what I'm trying to say is trying to highlight that, you know, it's a wider problem why that happened and how it happened. It's not only about race and racism, it's about political communication, it's about population management, it's about prejudice, it's about racist conceptions, racist perceptions too. So it's a bit of a complex equation if you want to try to understand what was going on in Guangzhou back in April 2020.
But if I may comment, but generally speaking, I think there needs to be consonance between central government policy in terms of African and Chinese relations, which is painted in a very rosy manner, and then local government problems, but particularly Chinese media problems that portray Africans as a threat, portray Africans as the 57th ethnic group, portray African as drug dealers in the popular media, this racial profiling, and so forth, you know. So is Guangzhou part of China, and does the Chinese government have authority over Guangzhou? Will there be legislation that governs the media to not do some of this heinous stereotyping of Africans in China? These are the questions. As for Guangzhou, as one Nigerian trader, when he was interviewed, this is what he said: there is no peace and security for Blacks in Guangzhou. The police check papers everywhere, in people's homes, on the bus, in the street, in the market, in the restaurants, everywhere. When I'm walking on the street, it's purely by the grace of God. I mean, this is unconscionable, okay? So on one hand, the Chinese government is painting its, you know, glorious Africa-China relationships. On the other hand, in Guangzhou, what you have is a police state oppressing African traders, you know? So there needs to be a consonance between national government policy of Africa, China, and local government policy of this type of behavior by the police and generally the media also. I'll tell you one thing, okay? Chinese workers, Chinese people in Africa are treated much more better. And I know in Ethiopia, a lot of Ethiopians feel that the Chinese are good people, hardworking people, and they have come to Ethiopia to help do the infrastructure and so forth and so on. Okay? And in fact, research has indicated that by and large, the Chinese people that have come to Africa today are well treated, except in some exceptional places, such as in Zambia and South Africa. I think Africans demand the same in China. You know.
Professor Huang?
Hi, yeah. I think Roberto made several very, very important points. First, he mentioned the paranoia, right, in Guangzhou, and in that particular, time period, people or the government was worried about the second outbreak from imported cases, right? But also, I think we have to try to understand why this paranoia, affected Africans more, right? So there's definitely a racial component there, the racist aspect there. And the Sanfei, the triple illegal narrative, that discourse definitely contributes to this paranoia, right? Because many people in China believe that Africans are illegal immigrants. They're all undocumented. That's why it's hard to know exactly when they come, where their whereabouts. So if you don't know where they are, where they come from, then it's incredibly hard to know whether they carry the disease, right? That's sort of the perception, right? So we have to understand how this Sanfei discourse affects, Africans particularly, severely. And, we have to look at how the laws or the implementation of the Sanfei laws, affected Africans more, because, there's three components of the, Sanfei designation, right? Those who enter, stay, and work in China illegally. But for local police or other law enforcement, it's particularly easy to catch African Sanfeis, because those who violate immigration regulations, most of Africans who violate these regulations, they overstay their visas. So all police have to do is just check their visas, right? But actually, many white foreigners, violate immigration regulations a lot. Actually, they can easily find, teaching jobs in China, teaching English. Or I've met people who work in a gym, and they are actually in no shape whatsoever to work as a trainer in a gym. But having a white foreigner working out in a gym sort of adds to the value of the gym. And I don't think they are working there legally, because that gym actually was operating. The gym that I went to was operating illegally, actually. So they took all the customers' money, and then they just closed, shut down. So there are actually many European foreigners who managed to find jobs in China without getting all the proper documentations. But for the police, it's incredibly hard to catch them, because for a long time China has a cash-based economy. You can still use cash a lot in China, although now people are using WeChats. But they can just say, I'm just working here for a friend. I'm not really getting paid. So there's nothing the police could do, right? So this sort of skewed the number of African Sanfeis in the statistics, and that sort of adds to the stigma that most illegal immigrants are blacks, and that contributes to this paranoia. And during that earlier this year, when they're worried about the second outbreak of the pandemic. But also, we need to understand, since Professor Castillo mentioned that Guangzhou is a very unique case, and I agree. Actually, But we also have to understand why, in what ways is Guangzhou unique before we can sort of possibly make changes, although I'm not very optimistic. Because we have to understand, I think we have to understand the urban politics in China, in Guangzhou in particular. The government for a long time have been, labeling areas where Africans reside in, rural urban transitional areas. These are areas that used to be villages, but as the city expanded, sprawl, they sort of become part of the city, but they sort of maintain their own individual or their rural land titles. That made it incredibly hard for the local government to redevelop these areas. But land development since the late 1980s has become the most important source of revenue for local governments. So they have been trying to take control of these areas for a long time. That's why many rural migrants across China who live in similar communities, they would share very similar experience with Africans, actually, mass evictions, tough social control measures. Rural migrants would, they are no stranger to such social control measures. But in Guangzhou, it's unique that there are a lot of Africans living in these communities. So if we're talking about whether we can change the situation for Africans, where do we go from here? That's a really, really difficult question to answer. We have to talk about urban politics in China. How do we change urban politics? How do we limit the importance of real estate to local governments? There's really no simple answer to this question. And on top of that, we have to deal with historical racial prejudice against Africans, right? So it's very difficult, very challenging.
And on top of that, if you look at the numbers that were reported in early 2020 of an African population in Guangzhou of around about 4,500 people in a city of like 20 million, it's like there's no pressure for any local government to implement any change for such a small population.
Well, with that, we're going to have to wrap it up because I have to go to class, but also because I promised these professors that I would let them go like 15 minutes ago over. So thank you all for coming. This was a really great conversation. I'm really happy with the participation also of people in the chat. I am hoping that I can make this conversation available to people online. Maybe you guys can email me if you don't want me to do that, if you don't want me to post it online. Yeah, you guys can let me know.
You can put it on YouTube if you ask me.
Okay, Professor Tesfaye, are you okay with that?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, you can send me an email if you're not okay with that. And then, yeah, I think a lot of people would be interested in this. I had a lot of people, professors at Columbia, say they thought this was very informative. So thank you all again. Thank you everyone for coming. And with that, I'm going to close out.
I want to thank my colleagues, Professor Castillo, Professor Huang, for a lively discussion.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Same here. Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you for the wonderful opportunity. Thank you.